B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, November 14th, 2019. I've got fresh comments on day one of the impeachment hearings on Capitol Hill, an attempt to arrest peace protester Code Pink's Medea Benjamin, lots of other stuff to comment on, and I might even get it to half an hour today. Who knows? But to begin, I want to recommend a movie for you to see. It is being rolled out this weekend. Lots of advertising for it today. My San Francisco Chronicle had a wraparound cover promoting a movie called The Report. And I got to see this when it screened at the Mill Valley Film Festival, 6-7 weeks ago. And I want to recommend that you go see it. Now, The Report chronicles Senator Dianne Feinstein's efforts to compile and publish, and she was able to compile and was not able to publish, a voluminous report on the CIA's torture program that began under President George W. Bush. And I think this is a very important story, and when Hollywood invests $100 million to tell a recent story that I think is quite significant, and I give it an A- for accuracy, well, I recommend that you go see it. Now, fundamentally, the message that is the clear takeaway is that Americans cannot trust the Central Intelligence Agency. And Adam Driver plays Daniel Jones, who was the lead investigator under Senator Feinstein in the Intelligence Committee. And he spent years in this secure room at CIA headquarters with a couple of associates, rifling through thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents and emails. It resulted in a 6,000-page report that was reduced to about a 500-page executive summary. And then they went to work to make the executive summary unreadable. And that's why the advertising for the report, I think, is so catchy, because they mocked up the front page of a San Francisco Chronicle and they blacked out huge passages of it. And that's what the torture report looked like when the CIA, the Obama White House, and others got finished hammering it and shredding it almost. So the reason I give it an A- is that the film sticks very closely to a narrative that doesn't include, for example, a guy named Barack Obama and his role in suppressing this important report. Doesn't touch on former CIA boss Leon Panetta and the Panetta Review that became almost a constitutional crisis when the CIA accused Dan Jones of breaking the rules and hacking into CIA systems to get a copy of the Panetta Review. Now, Dan Jones says he didn't do that. Dianne Feinstein believed him, and she went to the mat for him. And that's part of the persona of Dianne Feinstein that I do respect. And there are ironies that abound here. Number one, Dianne Feinstein screened the film in Washington last week and said she was flattered by Annette Bening's portrayal of her. And Bening has given interviews saying that she just played Feinstein straight up, didn't really mimic some of her quirks and some of her personality uniqueness. That's how I'll put it, because I've had my own encounters with Di-Fi over the years. But one of the ironies here is that while Feinstein likes the way Bening has portrayed her, it was James Gandolfini, Tony Soprano, portraying Leon Panetta, the CIA director, in the movie Zero Dark 30, that pissed Feinstein off so much that she was determined to go through with this investigation and try to publish the report. The other big irony is that Dan Jones, who I met briefly at the Mill Valley screening, I asked him for an interview, and he has sloughed me off. Dan Jones was seriously burned by the intelligence community, and in particular John Brennan and the CIA. And after he finished that project, he went on to set up his own business called Advanced Democracy. And what did he do? He went around to big Democratic donors, raised hefty millions of dollars, and he was using that to promote Russiagate, John Brennan's baby. And that's what I really wanted to ask Dan Jones about. I didn't telegraph that to him, so he didn't have any way of ducking the interview. I just think he only wants to talk to big media outlets because he's now a bit of a star, portrayed by Adam Driver. Now, speaking of John Brennan, I want to commend to you, and I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast, the latest essay by Phil Giraldi. Dr. Phil Giraldi served in the CIA, and he has been a sharp critic of his former employer in the years since. And publishing at the UNS Review, he exposes what he calls John Brennan's CIA Trump Task Force. He opens thusly, "There is considerable evidence that the American system of government may have been victimized by an illegal covert operation organized and executed by the U.S. intelligence and national security community. Former DNI Jim Clapper, former CIA Director Brennan, and former FBI Director James Comey appear to have played critical leadership roles in carrying out this conspiracy, and then may not have operated on their own." Oh, there's no then there. "And they may not have operated on their own. Almost certainly what they may have done would have been explicitly authorized by the former President Barack Obama and his national security team." And what he lays out here is what we have talked about before. It is the counter-narrative of Russiagate. And that was that it was set up to set up Trump. And I've offered you my theories about how George Papadopoulos came into the clutches of Dearlove, the ambassador from Australia. The British operation, run by Stephen Halper, in cahoots with Christopher Steele and the former head of MI6. And by the way, I just called the ambassador Dearlove. It was MI6 former director whose name is Dearlove. Sorry for the screw-up there. At any rate, back to Giraldi. No substantive evidence for the claim of serious Russian meddling has ever been produced in spite of years of investigation. But the real objective was to plant the story that would plausibly convince a majority of Americans that the election of Donald Trump was somehow illegitimate. Now, I do believe it was illegitimate. There was media malpractice. There was all kinds of election gaming, including voter suppression. The state of Michigan, I believe, the results were gamed there, and Hillary Clinton actually won. I say the same about Wisconsin, and other experts have cited Florida as a state that should have gone to Hillary Clinton. Anyway, back to Giraldi. The national security team acted to protect their candidate, Clinton, who represented America's deep state. And he does believe in a deep state, as he explains. He says, indeed, a number of former CIA directors have implicitly or even directly admitted to the existence of a deep state, like John McLaughlin. Responding to a question about Trump's concern over deep state involvement in the impeachment process, he said unambiguously, well, thank God for the deep state. With all the people we knew what was going on here, it took an intelligence officer to step forward and say something about it, which was the trigger that then unleashed everything else. That's a pretty ballsy admission. Back to Giraldi. It is now known that Obama's CIA Director Brennan created a Trump task force in early 2016. Rather than working against genuine foreign threats, this task force played a critical role in creating and feeding the meme that Trump was a tool of the Russians and a puppet of Putin. Working with Clapper, the DNI, Brennan fabricated the narrative that Russia had interfered in the 2016 election. Now, from there, Giraldi goes into different forms of speculation about the task force, what it should or might have done to achieve the articulated goals that he ascribes to Brennan and Clapper. And here's a quote: "The task force could also carry out other covert actions, sometimes using press or social media placements to disseminate fabrications about Trump and his associates. There has been some informed speculation that Guccifer 2.0 may have been a creation of this task force." And Giraldi closes his piece by asking, what did Obama know? And I mentioned this and the movie The Report to underscore that Americans cannot trust the Central Intelligence Agency. And we've seen this flip where Democrats embrace the deep state and the spooks because they see them as useful tools to get rid of Trump. And I'd love to get rid of Trump, just not through a deep state coup. So now Nancy Pelosi, trying to frame the impeachment process, took day one testimony and called it bribery. Quote, "The devastating testimony corroborated evidence of bribery uncovered in the inquiry, that the president abused his power, violated his oath by threatening to withhold military aid in a White House meeting in exchange for an investigation into his political rival, a clear attempt by the president to give himself an advantage in the 2020 election." Now, this term bribery does apply here. And I'm going to give you a couple of legal quotations here in a second. But because the aid was ultimately delivered, it was just delayed and the threat was made, many people can just rationalize it and say, well, nothing really happened. I heard an old, who was that guy? He was a Bush White House guy from Bush 1. Who was on the NewsHour last night. I'm sorry his name is not coming to mind. But, he played the game. He said, oh, these are very credible witnesses and people I deeply respect. But, of course, they didn't prove anything. And nothing really happened. There was no transaction to support a claim of extortion or bribery. And I think that many average Americans will be persuaded by that kind of a claim. But the Washington Post digs deep into legal writings, goes all the way back to the 1700s. So first up, Frank Bowman, who recently published a book, High Crimes and Misdemeanors. If we consider Trump as the recipient of a bribe, the thing of value is presumably an investigation of Biden or an announcement that such an investigation is being undertaken. Whether these are things of value is an interesting legal question. I can certainly make the argument that they are. Then they quote John Noonan, who's written a book about the history of bribery. The framers of our Constitution likely understood bribery to be an offense that includes both giving and accepting bribes. Then back to 1716, a treatise of the pleas of the crown by William Hawkins, and a 1797 list of indictable crimes in the state of Delaware defines bribery as an offense against public justice, including undue reward for someone in a position of power to influence him against the known rules of law, honesty, integrity, and adds he who accepts and he who offers the bribe are both liable to punishment. And so this is an interesting effort by Pelosi to once again boil down Ukraine-gate to something simple. But yesterday, when I was dropping off some dry cleaning, I was talking to the owner of the establishment. His name is Alan. Alan is mostly an NBA fan, and he admitted he was catching up, watching the hearings on his computer in between customers dropping by. And he said, man, this is so complicated. There's so many people, it's hard to keep track of them all. But bottom line, he believes Trump and the expanding conspirators did abuse presidential power. And when I raised the whataboutism, the Republicans keep talking about Joe and Hunter Biden, Alan, the dry cleaner, said, hey, look, if Biden did something wrong, investigate him legally. Call the FBI, but don't send Rudy Giuliani to try to squeeze a foreign power into what Alan thought would be a phony investigation. Some wisdom from the guy at the cleaners. And as Democrats try to take Trump to the cleaners, I'm looking at an essay by the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, David Sanger, and he boils it down based on the testimony yesterday that Trump had a choice between executing his administration's strategy for containing Russia or risking that to pursue his political obsession. Now, I don't see it as a binary choice like this. I'm sharing this with you because it's the framing of the newspaper of record that is on board with the Democrats to pursue this impeachment. And I certainly think that Trump is vulnerable here and that he has abused his power. But I also think that by the media giving Joe Biden and Hunter Biden a pass, just saying nothing there, it's all, bullshit, well, that leaves a lot of Americans calling bullshit on the New York Times because they listen to Trump's tweets on a daily basis. And so he quotes Bill Taylor and the crazy comment, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. It's counterproductive to all of what we had been trying to do. It was illogical. It could not be explained. It was crazy. And I do think it is crazy. Now, Sanger is catching up with my reporting, and PBS caught up with my reporting last night, and that is that these Javelin missiles, the anti-tank missiles that we have been wrangling over and that were delayed, they can't be used on the front lines by the Ukrainian forces. We're sending them to them with these restrictions. Put them in a military parade and show them off, but you can't use them in combat. And I don't fully understand the security reasons behind that, but that's what the Ukraine military has been told. Also, I just want to take us back to Bill Clinton's impeachment because I supported the House vote to impeach Bill Clinton on 2 of the 4 articles that were brought. And I supported the Senate's decision not to remove Bill Clinton for the articles that were passed out of the House. And I think that we have a situation today where there appear to be 0 Republicans. There I was still a Democrat when Clinton was in office. And I looked at the facts and I said, yeah, he lied under oath. That's perjury. That is a high crime or misdemeanor. But I don't think there are Republicans today who can put their partisanship aside. And so we heard all these excuses. The minimization of Trump's actions, the Republican lawyer who led much of the questioning in the session yesterday, his name is Steve Castor. He wrangled with Bill Taylor, trying to say that the irregular foreign policy channel that Rudy Giuliani was running was not as outlandish as it could be. And Taylor didn't even answer. He just kind of smirked and looked at the ceiling and said, Jesus. But that is the kind of tactic the Republicans are using. They're not denying what Trump did. They're just saying it wasn't that big a deal and he doesn't deserve to be impeached. And then there's Lindsey Graham, who tries to impose the frame of federal court proceedings and the rules of hearsay on this impeachment proceeding. It's completely ridiculous. But it makes sense to people who want to hear that Trump's not going to be impeached or removed from office. Over at The Guardian, they brought us a couple of quotes. Here's Jill Filipovich. One thing from the hearing was obvious. Democrats have a clear and compelling case that the president abused his office for personal gain. Republicans have a hodgepodge of half-baked defenses. Ukraine is corrupt and Trump cares about corruption. Yeah, that's a great joke. Ukraine didn't actually do what Trump asked. The aid was eventually released and everything is hearsay. Then we hear from Jessa Crispin, an author, host of the Public Intellectual podcast. She said that Taylor's composure and confidence seemed to rattle the Republicans. When Steve Castor was asking him the question I just related to you, Taylor looked confused. That said, I still find it hard to feel genuinely incensed by what I heard from the Congresspeople in the hearing today. Part of the reason is that the hearings present Trump's attempts to use another sovereign nation as a pawn as a radical break from American diplomacy. But is it really? And there are many examples. For example, JFK made a secret deal to remove American missiles from Turkey in exchange for an end to, or a relaxation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that quid pro quo did not benefit John F. Kennedy or his upcoming political campaign. And that is the big stinking difference here. So Rudy Giuliani's been on radio silence, sequestered off stage in a soundproof booth, but he took a call from The Guardian yesterday and was asked if he's nervous that Trump will try to throw him under a bus. After all, Trump, who gave Gordon Sondland direct access to him and got that phone call that violated security from a restaurant in Ukraine, now says he barely knows the guy. So when will his amnesia kick in on Rudy? And the mob lingo that Giuliani uses. He said, well, I'm not afraid of being thrown under a bus, but I do have very, very good insurance. So if he does, all my hospital bills will be paid. And then his lawyer, who was monitoring the call, injected that he was joking. But this is mob lingo and a mob mentality. And I think it really says a lot. Yesterday in the hearing, Bill Taylor was reciting chapter and verse, of course, never admitting that the U.S. backed the coup that threw out Yanukovych in 2014 and led to Joe Biden presiding over U.S. policy to Ukraine as his son took the cushy job on the Burisma board. And one of the things that Taylor, and I also think Mr. Bowtie, recited was that Russia has been blamed for the shoot-down of MH17, which killed almost 300 people when it was shot down over Ukraine. And I've always been skeptical of these reports because I haven't seen substantial evidence. And the BUK, the Buk anti-aircraft battery that was used to shoot down MH17, was in the arsenal of Ukraine and Russia. And so we haven't seen the evidence of which Buk launched the missiles that took down the airliner. And now they're promoting a release of new intercepted phone calls, which do show that there were people in Moscow who were communicating on a daily basis with the fighters in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine. And this coverage by The Guardian suggests that simply because there were a lot of phone calls before the shoot-down of the airliner, that is proof of some sort. They need to release the contents of the calls, if they have it, before I would find that the least bit convincing. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the PBC podcast with your subscriptions. People like Jim Garrison, Carl Howard, Cliff Johnson, and John Zwiebel in Hawaii. He's there on the first of the month, right next to Paul L. Sesser in the mailbox, with his monthly contribution. I invite you to support my work, too. Visit peterbcollins.com. Click on menu. Click on Become a Subscriber. You hit the sign-up page, and in seconds, you can set up a subscription that fits your budget. And if you're allergic to PayPal, use the U.S. mail and address it to Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Kevin Gostola is a talented young reporter who publishes at Shadowproof, and he captured the events in Washington, D.C., where Medea Benjamin, the co-founder of Code Pink and a woman I've known since the early 1990s, I have deep respect for her commitment to peace. And so this week, there was a news conference called by Debbie Wasserman Schultz and a Republican colleague from Florida, Mario Diaz-Balart, announcing a bipartisan Venezuela Democracy Caucus because they support the Trump idea of regime change in Venezuela. So, Medea Benjamin shows up with a sign that says no coups, Bolivia, Venezuela. And they're apparently on some kind of a small riser, and there are a lot of people jammed in there. And at a certain point, some of the pro-Venezuelan people, the pro-Guaido people, are kind of pushing and shoving. And so Medea Benjamin grabbed for the nearest support, and it happened to be Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the discredited former chair of the DNC. And Benjamin, who was being attacked in some way that caused her to say, "You're hurting me," then heard Wasserman Schultz saying, "Let go of me. We're going to need to call the Capitol Police. This woman is assaulting me." And then Wasserman Schultz adds, "There's a video of this. She's assaulting me, and get off me." So this has been converted. Medea Benjamin was being attacked at one point. She was being choked. And she apparently leaned on the Congresswoman, and this is being construed as assault. So later that day, by the way, Medea moved to Washington from San Francisco some years ago. So the Capitol Police, who are under the control of members of Congress, show up at her house, and they're trying to arrest her or get her to come down to their police office. But they really didn't know much about the story. They were still trying to run it down. Benjamin showed them some of her footage from the incident. And so while they invited her to come to the police station, they didn't arrest her, and she remains at large at this moment. In Bolivia, meanwhile, there were more violent protests on Wednesday. Tear gas was used to break up a peaceful protest by supporters of Morales, Evo Morales, the recently deposed president. And police blocked about a dozen senators allied with Morales from entering the legislature. Now, these are the same people who denied a quorum when Senator Janine Áñez Chávez proclaimed herself president, or at least interim president, and this has led to charges from Evo Morales that she is not legitimate because it wasn't approved by the legislature. Now, I want to thank Ian Berman, because yesterday I couldn't find the quote from Áñez Chávez, the racist quote based on Christian superiority and white supremacy over the indigenous people of Bolivia. So here is the quote. "I dream of a Bolivia free of satanic indigenous rituals. The city is not for the Indians. They should go to the highlands or to Chaco." And I paraphrased that yesterday as they should go back to where they came from, like Trump and the squad. Want to recommend a great piece over at the Gray Zone Project under the byline of Jeb Sprague, and it shows that the plotters of the coup in Bolivia, almost to a man, are graduates of America's infamous School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. Oh, it's got a different name now. I can never remember what it is. But it is stunning to see how our training of paramilitaries, counterinsurgency tactics, and good old coup preparation has paid off. And I've linked to it in the show file. I'm running late here, so I encourage you to read it, and I think you'll be persuaded that this is no kind of organic coup and that the U.S. is very likely involved in supporting, if not helping promote and provoke the coup. There's also a good piece of commentary from Nick Estes, who is a Native American of the Sioux tribe, and he writes that Evo Morales means a lot to indigenous people like him. Meanwhile, the disproportionate response to rockets fired from Gaza, which were provoked by Tuesday's Israeli raids on senior commanders of Islamic Jihad, has led to almost 400 rockets being fired at Israel. We've heard no fatalities or even injuries from the Gaza rockets, but the disproportionate response by Israel continues. Bombing has been almost regular, and at least 32 Palestinians are dead in this round so far. And the corporate media always plays it that violence has just erupted. They don't claim, as I do, accurately, that Israel provoked this. The protests continue in Beirut, where thousands of people blocked major highways and roadblocks were set up, trying to get the president, Michael Ayoun, to resign. They want a completely new government. And the half measures that have been advanced by political leaders don't appear to be satisfying the protesters. Same is true in Hong Kong, where today is the fourth day of a general strike. It's made it hard for many people to go to work. And we're seeing that the city's infrastructure has been forcing, the shutdown has forced commuters to choose whether to venture out and risk being caught up in the clashes and tear gas. Also recommend some comments by Craig Murray, the former British ambassador, who writes about the death of James Le Mesurier. I don't know if I'm saying that name right, Mesurier. He was the leader of the White Helmets, who reportedly committed suicide. But Murray notes that the man's usefulness to Western security services, Israel, and their Gulf allies came to an end when the jihadist head choppers, to whom Le Mesurier had been providing logistical support and invaluable propaganda, lost their last secure footing in Syria. And Murray blurts it out this way: that the White Helmets worked hand in glove with the extreme jihadists and moved out wherever they moved out is beyond dispute as a matter of fact, whatever the state of denial in the mainstream media. That there is now nowhere in Syria that people can go around executing Christians with impunity, and simultaneously now nowhere that the White Helmets can operate, is not the coincidence the mainstream media affect to believe. The Kentucky governor's race has been settled as the Republican Trump boy Matt Bevin has conceded. He couldn't close the gap of 5,000 votes, and Democrat Andy Beshear will take over. The all-blue composition now in Virginia, governor, both houses of the legislature, has led to plans to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Virginia was a holdout state, and I believe that when Virginia passes it, that will reach the 38 needed for ratification. Now, the ERA was first introduced in 1923. It was adopted by Congress in 1972. It simply says that you cannot discriminate based on sex. Now, there is one hurdle. The deadline passed in 1982 to collect all of the state-level ratifications, and Democrats in Congress are hoping to fix that. And finally today, I have been remiss, but this story's been sitting here for almost 4 days now. Rodney Reed is on death row in Texas, scheduled to be executed next week, November 20th. He is accused of raping and murdering Stacy Stites in 1996. But despite the fact that Rodney Reed's DNA showed up in her body, despite the fact that he said he'd been having a secret affair with her, well, she had a fiancé at the time, Jimmy Fennell, a former police officer who spent some time in prison himself. He pled guilty to kidnapping a woman he had encountered while on duty, and the woman said he had also raped her. So Jimmy Fennell, while he was in prison, allegedly confessed to a cellmate, and that cellmate has now come public with a statement. Will that be enough to hold off on an execution in Texas? I'm afraid I know the answer to that question. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment. You can share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I am Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.